Good evening. Welcome back to Whisper of the Night, where old tales are retold in shadows and silence, and forgotten emotions are gently brought back to life. Tonight, we revisit a story you may think you already know. The Ugly Duckling isn't just a children's tale. It's a powerful message about finding beauty in diversity. This version will challenge your understanding of beauty and quietly invite you to embrace the parts of yourself the world once called wrong. So, are you ready to hear the story again? This time, from the place where pain begins and transformation takes root. The tale they told us. They told us it was just a children's story. A lonely little duckling, mocked, rejected, cast aside, who would one day grow into something beautiful, a happy ending, wrapped in feathers and forgiveness. But tonight, we peel back that softness. We return to the story not as children, but as the versions of ourselves who have lived through the sting of silence, the cold of being different, the ache of waiting to be seen. The Ugly Duckling isn't just a bedtime fable, it's a mirror. Originally penned by Hans Christian Andersen in the 19th century, the tale was more than a simple moral lesson. It was his truth, his loneliness poured onto the page. The duckling, misunderstood and outcast, was Andersen himself, a boy who never belonged, a man who wandered through life feeling misplaced in his own skin. And yet, that story has endured. Why? Because we have all, at some point, felt like the one who didn't belong. Because the world still whispers that if we're different, we are somehow wrong. And because, deep down, many of us are still waiting for the moment we become beautiful enough to be accepted. So tonight, we revisit this tale through a different lens. This is no longer just about a duckling. This is about a child who didn't fit in, a girl whose body was never enough, a boy who loved differently, a voice that cracked too loud, a gaze that lingered too long. This is about you, if you've ever felt like your reflection didn't match the world's idea of who you should be. The Ugly Duckling becomes a symbol, not of transformation into beauty as defined by others, but of the quiet, painful courage it takes to remain yourself in a world that demands your silence. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing is not that you are different, but that you were never meant to be anything else. They called it ugly, but what they really meant was different. In a world that worships sameness, where beauty is measured in symmetry and silence, to be different is to be dangerous. But difference is not a flaw, it's a flame. And when it is protected, nurtured, and allowed to burn freely, it illuminates the world in ways conformity never could. Look around you. The most vibrant societies are not built on likeness, but on diversity, in language, in skin, in thought, in the way some dance when they speak and others speak with silence. It is the artist who dares to paint in shadows, the voice that cracks with emotion when others stay composed, the soul that refuses to fit into pre-written scripts, who brings colour to the grey. Across history, the most beautiful revolutions began with someone who refused to hide their difference. Frida Kahlo painted her pain and called it art. James Baldwin wrote the truth and called it love. Greta Thunberg stood alone and called it hope. They were mocked, dismissed, until the world realised they were swans all along. And what about you? Have you spent your life shrinking to fit, quieting your laughter, covering your scars, apologising for the way you speak, walk, love? What if your difference is not your weakness, but the very thing that sets you free? There is no single image of beauty, no singular voice that deserves to be heard, no correct shape for a soul to take. The duckling's journey was never about becoming something better. It was about realising he had been a swan all along. Take a breath, look into the mirror with new eyes, and say, not with shame but with tenderness, "This is me, and I am enough." They never said the words out loud, but you felt it in the way their eyes slid off of you, in the pause before they spoke your name, in the laughter that wasn't meant to be cruel, but still stung like it was. You were the one who didn't fit. Too quiet, too loud, too slow, too much. And so, like any creature trying to survive, you learned to hide. Not behind walls. No, that would be too obvious. You hid behind smiles, behind straightened backs and lowered eyes, behind clothes that weren't yours and words you didn't believe. a mask, not made of porcelain or silk, but of small daily betrayals, the kind that seem harmless at first until you no longer remember the shape of your own face. The mirror became your enemy because it showed you someone you couldn't accept, not because you were wrong, but because you had been taught to believe that only certain kinds of right existed, and you weren't one of them. The duckling did not hate himself at first. He only wanted to belong, to be warm, to be loved. But the world, in its quiet cruelty, made sure he saw himself through its eyes that measured his worth by feathers and form, by smoothness, by silence, by similarity. And so the duckling began to look into the water, not with curiosity, but with dread. He stared long enough to memorize what he wasn't. Not golden like the others, not graceful, not enough. And he learned to perform, to tuck in his wings, to walk smaller, to speak softer, to apologize for the way he looked, before anyone had the chance to point it out. This is how we survive, isn't it? By shrinking ourselves into versions that the world finds easier to swallow, by smiling in pictures where we are invisible, by nodding when we want to scream, by pretending the cage is a costume we chose. But even the finest mask will crack, because the soul, no matter how bruised, does not forget its shape. And there comes a day when you cannot pretend to be someone else without dying a little each time you try. The duckling looked into the water, not to admire himself, but to disappear. And that is where transformation begins. Not in beauty, not in praise, but in the silence that comes right after you give up pretending. There comes a moment, quiet, unnoticed, when staying becomes more painful than leaving. The duckling did not run away in anger. He left because he believed they were right, that he was wrong, that he had to go so they could be happier. Exile rarely begins with rebellion, it begins with surrender. He walked away from the farm, from the fields where the sun once kissed his shell, from the pond where he first his reflection and wished it was someone else. He did not look back, because when you carry shame, the past is not a memory. It's a mirror you dare not face. The world outside was not kinder, but it was quieter. He wandered through reeds and thorns, slept beneath crooked trees, drank from puddles too shallow to reflect. In the distance he saw flocks, ducks, swans, geese, each group with their own rules, their own codes of belonging. He tried, once or twice, to fit in, to mimic the way they held their heads, to match the rhythm of their steps. But difference has a scent. And even before he spoke, they knew he was not one of them. "You're too strange. You're too quiet. You make us uncomfortable." So he stopped trying, not out of pride, but fatigue. He began to live like shadow, present, but untouchable, moving through the world with no expectation of being seen. But still, there were moments, a whisper of wind that felt like a hand, a lone feather drifting beside him on the water, a flicker of light between the trees, small mercies. Not enough to heal, but just enough to keep going. And one night, a winter night colder than bone, with frost biting into his skin like teeth, he looked up and saw them, swans, pure, glowing white, cutting through the night sky like stars torn free. He watched them, breathless, not with envy, but with longing. Not to be like them, but to be home, somewhere, anywhere, where he wouldn't have to explain why he existed. He didn't know then that they were more than a dream, that inside him, under the mud, the bruises, the silence, the same wings waited. But that night he only curled into himself and whispered into the snow, "I'm still here." Though no one answered. The awakening winter stretched long, a quiet that clung to everything. The duckling no longer sought warmth. He had grown used to the cold, outside and within. There were no more questions, no more tears, just breath, one after another, enough to keep him alive, until one morning the stillness broke. He wandered to a frozen pond drawn not by hope but by habit. And there, in the half-melted surface, he saw a shape, familiar, but not. The neck, long. The eyes, gentle. The feathers, white. He looked around, certain someone else must be standing nearby. But the reflection moved as he did, turned when he turned, lifted its head when he dared to raise his own. He had waited so long for the world to change, for someone to love him enough to make him beautiful. But nothing had changed, except that he had stopped running. And in the quiet of being no one, he had finally become himself. It wasn't magic, it wasn't revenge, it wasn't justice, it was truth. He was never meant to be a duck, and that was never the problem. The pain did not come from being different. It came from trying to be the same. They told him to shrink, to soften, to vanish, but his bones had always belonged to the sky, and his heart to a song he hadn't yet remembered how to sing. That morning, he did not weep. He did not celebrate. He simply stood and felt his own wings, not new, not gifted, his. They had been waiting all along. He did not return to show them he had changed. He did not fly back with rage in his eyes or beauty as a weapon. He simply moved forward, not to prove anything, but because the world was wide and his wings were real. In time, others would see him, gasp at his grace, marvel at how something ugly had become so radiant. But they missed the truth. He had always been radiant. They just hadn't known how to look. You see, it was never about becoming beautiful. It was about becoming free. And now maybe it's your turn. How many years have you spent trying to be what they wanted? How many mirrors have you stared into, asking why you couldn't be someone else? How many parts of yourself have you buried just to be enough? But what if enough isn't something you reach, but something you already are? You are not broken. You are not a mistake. You are not too much or too little. You are a swan who has forgotten he was born with wings. So now, breathe. Look into the mirror with different eyes. Not the eyes they gave you, but the ones you've earned through every scar, every exile, every quiet morning you chose to stay alive. Whisper to the child inside you, you were never ugly. They just didn't see you clearly. And when you are ready, rise. Not for applause, not for validation, but because you can, because you are, because you always were.